It's time for another episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show, a podcast where I connect you with thought leaders from across the globe, digging into some of my favorite topics like personal development, marketing, spirituality, and pretty much any other shiny object that happens to catch my attention. Today, my very special guest is Michelle Steele, and we're going to be talking about her brand new book, Escaping Hell, a true story of God's miraculous power to restore a life bent on destruction. Michelle, I have been so looking forward to this conversation. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Shaun. It's an honor to be here and to be able to share my life story with other people.
Well, I'm always eager to talk to our Destiny Image and Harrison House authors and do my part to get our messages, these wonderful stories and testimonies out to the world. I think the place I'd like to begin today is just by having you share a little bit of what I like to call the story behind the book. I always say, for any message, there is a season that God ordains for the author to walk out writing a message. We have to relive it. We have to think about, man, what does it look like to package this up for somebody else to read, to experience? But God always shapes us and changes us, teaches us things in that journey. And so I'd love to just hear a little bit about, for you, the writing journey for this book. What did that look like? What were the challenges? What were the graces? How did God impact you along that path?
Well, the first half of the book is my testimony. And it came at a point where I knew God wanted me to be able to share the details and share it in a way that wasn't covered in Christianese with a whole lot of churchy talk in it. So I actually wrote my testimony portion in a week and a half. It was one of those situations where I didn't put on makeup for days because I was crying the whole time I was writing it out. I was going back through to make sure I wasn't putting anything in it that would be hard for a person who hasn't walked with God to understand. And I really wanted to make it as emotionally raw as the time I was walking through it, and as we talk more about it, we'll understand what I mean by that emotionally raw with the addiction and the life of crime and the, overdoses, those all of the things that led up to that, all of the things that I was going through at the time that I was, prostituting and in that grip of addiction. And so it was one of those things I just set aside my whole calendar to give my attention to that. But this year marks 30 years of me walking with the Lord, clean from the drugs, free from the shame and the condemnation of my past. And I was able to take the 5 most important fundamental things that God used during these last 30 years to help me stay on his path and to be able to walk free in him. And so that portion was a lot of fun in that I was able to really pinpoint those things that have helped me the most from the Word of God and from my walk with God. And that I believe will help everybody, whether they've ever been in the same shoes I was walking in or not. Every person can benefit from these 5 fundamentals.
And I so love that God in his kindness gives you a book as you hit that 3-decade milestone of walking with him. It's like, we're going to have a 30th anniversary celebration. I think that's so cool. In
Yes.
terms of the why for culture, so you shared a little bit about the experience of writing for you and what God was doing. As you look across kind of the darkness of our world, who is that potential reader, that potential audience that you see as really needing to encounter your story and your testimony? Because, man, the world around us is so dark right now. Just if your vision for the world this book is coming into, who needs it? Who is this for?
Well, I believe, as I said, there are portions that will be able to speak to the person who doesn't know anything about God, who has been walking in their own reasoning, dealing with their situations and their oppressive burdens, trying to figure out, how do I fix my life? That person will be able to identify with the Michelle Steele before Christ. That person will be able to identify with that loss. I don't know how to fix this problem that I was in. Also for the person who has been walking with God but not experiencing victory, and maybe they've got the shame and the condemnation from their past mistakes still in their life today. That person's going to find answers in this book. There are things. It's kind of like all these different pieces of my life that I can put on display to help somebody who might be at that stage in their life. And so I think there is an audience of many different varieties that people are going to be able to benefit.
Well, I think of, the person who's going through many of the same things or has gone through a lot of the same things you've gone through. I see that definitely as an audience. I also think of family and friends who are trying to understand and figure out how to minister to people who are walking through tough seasons and tough choices. I also think, too, in terms of just a testimony, that transformation is possible, that when God gets on the inside of us, he can turn anything around. And I think that's also a beautiful part of your story and your journey. I would agree. You don't have a lot of Christianese in the opening chapters of the book. It reads like a very raw story of just somebody being very honest and straightforward and saying it is what it is. And so I really appreciate that you didn't sugarcoat it, and you really told it how it needed to be told. I think next I'd love to have you just kind of paint the picture of kind of your life in the sense of take us up to that point before your near death experience, and feel free to, if you want to go on for even 10 minutes, however whatever length of time you need to really paint that story. But on the one hand, our audience loves talking about near death experiences, so I do want to focus on that specifically for a bit. But I just want to give you the freedom to share your story. You had a very troubled and challenging upbringing in teen years, and as you've implied, there are just so many terrible things going on. So I'm just going to sit back and mute myself and let you share your story.
Well, as you mentioned, there were a lot of triggers in my youth, in my childhood, that put me on a path of destruction. To all appearances, I was eating with the silver spoon, that proverbial silver spoon that, I was in a very affluent part of Hendersonville, Tennessee. When I went trick or treating at country music singers. When I got my first babysitting job, it was for a person who was a regular on the Grand Ole Opry. When I got my driver's license, I got my driver's license in a Mercedes Benz. It looked like I had everything already going for me. My parents were going to send me to college. But on the inside, there was an inner self destruction that was playing out. And it there were things, rejections and heartbreaks. But I think the real trigger began when during my childhood I was molested by three different adults that should have been people who were watching out for me, people who were responsible for my well-being, but instead they took that position and became predators. And that turned inward on me because I blamed myself. The circumstances around it, I'd lied to be in certain positions, I'd lied to be in certain scenarios. And so I felt like this is my fault. And they made me feel like it was my fault in some of the situations. And so I began to blame myself, and I began to hate myself, and I began to turn everything that should have been good for me against me. And so that self destruction started me on a path of experimenting with drugs and alcohol, sneaking out of my house, and lying about where I was so that I was in even more vulnerable situations. And in that rebellion that was started more from that inner destruction, I ended up running away from home. And when I ran away from home, I ended up on the streets of Nashville, Tennessee. I got connected with someone who was about my same age, but they'd lived on the streets a lot longer. I mean, they were street smart, and that person became my pimp and later my husband, my first husband. And so, in that lifestyle on the streets, ended up becoming addicted to drugs. And I would have to say the addiction to the drugs was not because I was trying to, um, the addiction to drugs wasn't for fun. It became a way for me to escape the reality of my life and all the mistakes that I'd made and all of the pain on the inside that I had caused and all of the relationships that I had destroyed. You know, I ran away from home. My parents didn't trust me. I'd broken all those relationships. I ended up, during that time of addiction, pregnant with my first child. We It was the whole in and out of drugs. I'd come off of drugs during that time that I was carrying her. And then right after I had her, he convinced me. That was when I began prostituting, right after. I'd actually started the prostitution while I was pregnant with her, but I wasn't doing drugs at the time. And so that addiction really escalated the deeper into the pain and the shame and the destruction that was working on the inside of me. And so during that time, the crime, the addiction, it was all just becoming more out of control and more out of control. And let me tell you about the first time that I died of a drug overdose, because it's important to compare the two, because I died two different times. And the first time I had been doing drugs, cocaine, nonstop. And it was no food. We would just go constantly to get more drugs and more drugs. And so with cocaine, it's just like you're on this hunt, a chase. And so it was about 3 days into this binge of drugs, and we were in a hotel room, and he was pulling up the drugs. And it was during a time even before AIDS had become even a thing. And so when we got into a drug binge, we would share needles. And so he had pulled up my cocaine and his cocaine into one needle. There was another man who was in the room who was supplying drugs for us. And when he put the needle into my arm, he forgot that it had his and mine, and he gave me the whole portion. And at that point, my head fell back, my eyes rolled back in my head, my heart stopped beating. The other man in the room grabbed the drugs, left the room, and my husband was in there trying to figure out how to revive me. He didn't know how to do CPR. So he drugged me to the shower, turned on the cold water, held me up with one hand against the wall, and took his fist and punched me in the chest until I came back to life, until I began to breathe again. I was numb and speechless for an hour. For an hour, he was trying to get me to speak. And when I did speak, I remember hearing him say, "What's my name? Who am I? What's your name? What year is it?" Asking me questions, and I couldn't answer him. I would just look at him and I couldn't answer him. And when I did get enough coherent and become enough coherent to be able to speak, I just asked, "Is there any more cocaine?" That's how deep into that addiction that it was. And so I want to share that because it's a comparison for me about how different and how drastic that overdose was compared to my second overdose. We continued for a number of years after that. We took a little bit of break because it really shook him to the core that I had died. I wasn't as aware of what had happened, because I was out of it. So we took a little bit of break, had another child during that time, and after he was born, someone brought brought us a bottle of Dilaudid that someone had left from a cancer patient, and they said, "Here, you can sell this Dilaudid and get back on your feet." we ended up doing the Dilaudid and ended up deeper into the addiction. And it was during that time that, with the prostitution, with I began to notice that he was doing something while I was out with the escort company, the prostitution that I was working for. And I said, "You're out doing something and you're getting money and getting high." And so I was, accusing him of it. And so he said, "Get in the car." And so I got in the car and he went and robbed 3 gas stations with me in the car, and we were arrested. And that um, became like a pinnacle, a moment where, all of the destruction was coming to a head. And it was after that time when he was being faced with the possibility of spending time in the penitentiary that his grandmother talked him into going to church. And he said, "I'm going to church with Granny this morning. Why don't you come to church with me?" And I said, "I'm not going to church. If I go to church, the walls are going to fall in." I made all of the excuses, all of the hard, tough exterior as to why I wouldn't go to church. But on the inside, I thought to myself, God hates me. Why would I go to church? What would God want with me and the mess that I've made of my life? And so he got up and went to church that morning. When the gospel was preached, he walked the aisle, gave his life to Jesus. And it was the church where my children went with their grandmother. And so when they all came home from church, there was a difference in him. There was a light in him. He was interested. He didn't have an education that he could read very well. And so he made me read the Bible to him. I'm like, "I don't want to read the Bible to you." And somebody had given him a cassette tape of some Christian music, some bluesy Christian music. And he was like, "I really like this." And he's listening to Christian music, making me read the Bible to him, asking his grandmother questions about the Holy Spirit, about, things that he had heard in the sermon that day. And I was infuriated. I was like, "I'm ready to go get high. What do you mean, read the Bible?" But what a difference there had been in his life. And it was something that I took note of. And the next day we went to court. And while we were there waiting for the court appearance, someone came and brought it was the size of a piece of paper, but it was a morphine patch. And it was something that was being given to different people who were facing terminal illness. And so it was supposed to last for 3 days. And someone had stolen it and brought it to him and said, "If you get taken into prison today, they won't notice this at first, and then you can just rip it off later. And if they take you in, you'll be able to sleep through the first 3 days of processing." And they didn't take him in that day because he was out on bond. So they gave him a date to turn himself back in, but he pled guilty. And in that guilty plea, he made a bargain for the charges to be dropped against me. And so we went home and thought, okay, everything, we're on this path. But he was so high from that patch that they had given him. And he's still wanting me to read the Bible to him. He's still listening to that Christian music. And I was mad because he was high and I wasn't. I was like, we need to I'm going to go get something. But we didn't have any money. And so I didn't, he said, "Tomorrow I'll take you and help you get something." So that night, the 3 days worth of morphine released into his body, and he never woke up in the morning. And when in the morning, when I woke up, he was still breathing, but it was a very labored breathing. And I thought, wow, I never have heard him snore before. But I didn't understand what had happened. I was trying to wake him up. I was trying to make noise to wake him up. And there was, I was letting the kids in the room and activity go on. We were there at his grandmother's house because of the situation we were in. And so I remember I was vacuuming in the room trying to wake him up. And I turned the vacuum off. And when I turned around and looked at him, I realized he's not breathing. And I began to scream for his grandmother to call the paramedics. And I ran over. I didn't know how to do CPR. I'm trying to push on his chest, and he was on this soft bed. So I thought I'll pull him onto the floor. And he was just, so hard to move. I couldn't get him off the bed, and he was covered in sweat. So it was so hard for me to try to move him. And I'm screaming at him and trying to get his heart to beat and to do something. And the paramedics were right down the street. We were down the street from the fire department. So they were there in no time, and they began doing CPR, and doing CPR as they're loading him into the back of the ambulance. And they put me in the front of the ambulance, and his family is following behind us. And I'm trying to explain about the patch that's on his side and the morphine that was supposed to last for 3 days. And when we get there, they take us to a special room, and the people that come in begin to tell us, they said, well, we did get his heart to beat again, but they didn't have, it wasn't a positive thing. It wasn't something they were very, promising about. And we began to realize this was more serious. We just thought, well, they'll resuscitate him and everything will be fine. But they began to explain that the morphine had released into his body and that he hadn't been breathing properly. And what I was hearing wasn't snoring. It was the agonal breathing that was explaining that he was in that last stage. And so he did not regain consciousness. And during the time that we had him on the machines, people came to the hospital with drugs for me, and they would take me into the bathroom and they would bring me Dilaudid and cocaine, and I'm shooting cocaine and shooting Dilaudid in the bathroom of the hospital. And someone came to me who had prayed with him that day and from the church. And I thought, this person doesn't look like he's from the church. He had a big biker's vest and a beard and long hair, and he's carrying this huge Dake's Bible. And I thought, what did this church send me? And this man walks in and he said, I want to take you down to the chapel and talk to you, because it was there in the family visitation room. It was hard to talk to me. And so he convinced me to go. And on the way, somebody met me in the hallway and put cocaine in my hand. So I put the cocaine in my pocket, and I've got cocaine in my pocket. I've got a syringe in my shoe. And this guy wants to talk to me in the chapel. He begins to share the gospel with me. And all I could think of was, I got to get him out of here, because I'm going to go get high. But he wouldn't let me answer with a yes or no answer. He wouldn't let me just, fluff him off and say, yeah, whatever. Okay, fine. Thank you for coming. I appreciate your prayers or whatever. He made me think about what he was saying, and he made me answer with a complete sentence. And I have to say, Shaun, it was the first time, all those years of living in the buckle of the Bible Belt, I had never really thought personally about what Jesus did on the cross. And when he shared that with me and forced me to answer him in a complete sentence, there was a tiny glimmer of hope that came up in me. And he said, pray this prayer with me. And I prayed that prayer. And all I'm thinking in the back of my mind at this point is, God, if you want to help me, if you could help me, I want your help. I really do need your help. And he prayed with me. And that all I had was a glimmer of hope. It wasn't lightning strikes or anything that was very evident that something had changed in me, but I just had a little bit of hope. If God would help me, I need God's help. And I went down into the emergency room bathroom, locked the door, pulled that cocaine up, put it in my arm, and I couldn't feel anything. And months later, I found a scripture in the Bible that said, you're snared by the words of your mouth. I didn't realize what God had done at that moment when I asked him to help me. But because I was lacking knowledge and I didn't have any understanding of what I was doing or what God wanted to do through me or with me, when we took the life support off of his body and he passed, I went into a whirlwind of destruction unlike any that I had seen in all of those previous years of addiction. Somebody else was taking care of my children. They took out a life support. I signed it, or a life insurance policy on me. I signed it and said, hey, I don't know what's going to happen. And so I began on that path of destruction and trying to get myself off drugs. I went and got onto a methadone program, which was almost disastrous because I totaled cars that I don't know where I left them. One car, they said I had drove it into front of somebody's front door and I walked away from it. I went and got a Bible for 25 cents from the thrift store. And I'm trying to read that Bible and I'm reading and I'm on the methadone and I'm falling asleep, nodding out, reading the Bible, trying to fix my life. Somebody got a hold of me and kind of had me in a position in the bar, in the back of the bar. He was a person who had been a sugar daddy from before. And so he started supplying me cocaine. And so I'm in the back of this bar 3 days again into this cocaine binge. And I keep telling him I can't feel it anymore. And he begins to give me more cocaine and more cocaine. And I said, give me more because I can't feel it. And so when he did, I pulled it all up. I put it in my arm. And before I could even draw the needle out of my arm, I left my body. And when I left my body, if I could explain this, and I know I've gone right into this point of talking about.
Well, and let me give you a break
This
for a moment
moment.
because I've had you
Okay.
talking for a bit. Uh, I'd love to have you just kind of walk us through some of the mechanics of what you were experiencing as well. You know, because my audience is very familiar with kind of the framework or the steps of a typical NDE experience. But everyone is a little bit different. Not every experience follows the same pattern. But I'd love specifically to have you take us, into going into the out of body experience. Did you see anything, feel anything, hear anything? What changed in your senses? Because people often talk about when they leave their body, there's a release or a relief, or it's different. But all of a sudden, senses are often kind of turned up to 11 because you're no longer hindered by your physical body because you're in your spiritual body. So yeah, just walk us into kind of I guess give us kind of the broad description of what that was like. I'd love to have you go into as much detail as you feel comfortable sharing.
Well, I have to say, I have never experienced the clarity that I experienced in that moment. It was more real than anything that I had ever known up until that moment. And there have been a couple of times that I've been at that place since, but before that, never. Before that time, it was like I was living under a cloud or living under a blanket of confusion and a blanket of um, darkness and things that obscure. It was like obscurity before that moment. And in that moment, it was like all of that obscurity was lifted. All of the confusion was lifted, all of the filter. It was like there were absolutely no filters on my thinking or on my ability to reach out and touch at that moment. When in that moment of clarity, what was for me the most real thing in that moment was the reality of hell. Before that moment, I thought it was just a joke. It was something that we sang songs about, Highway to Hell. And it was something that was, when I get to hell, I'm going to teach the devil a few things. We're going to party with the devil. Before that moment, it was always something that there was no fear about it. There wasn't anything exciting about it necessarily, but it was something that had, up until that moment, not really shook me, not really bothered me. I had already as I said before, I thought I'm going to go to hell. I didn't even think heaven would have been an option. So there was no expectation that I would ever get to heaven. So I had just assigned, I just come to the realization that's where I'm going to go. And so in that moment, I realized the horror of it. I realized the eternity of it. It was like in that moment, to try to explain it, I would have to say it was like things faster than you would know them in real time. In this time, I'll say real time because I'm not sure this seems real right now, but in that moment, that seemed more real. Does that make sense?
Yep. Yeah. Very, very in line with, I mean, I've probably talked to 50 plus experiencers in the past couple years. And yeah, I mean, everything about the earthbound experience pales in comparison, feels less real to what somebody experiences on the other side of the veil, so to speak.
Yes. That's a great example or a great phrase to use, the veil. It was as if I was outside of a veil or a partition. It was like I was on the other side of that partition and I could see and understand in a moment without having to go through the mental processes. It was like I knew that the reality of hell, the horror of hell, the pain of hell, the torture of hell in just like a quick second, all of that was real to me at that moment. When the reality of hell, that's hell. I'm standing, what I saw was a skull. It was as tall as I am tall. And I was standing in front of it, and it wasn't a whole skeleton, it was just the skull. And I'm in that instant realizing the eternity of it, how there's no escape from it, the pain, the torture, and the fear of it. And at that moment, hands, and they weren't black hands, they were darkness. It was as if darkness had hands. It was like 1 minute it was darkness, and the next minute that darkness formed fingers and hands and began to reach for me. And as it began to reach for me, and this all happened in an instant. But it seemed like it seemed like such a a long moment that I was there. The hands began to reach for me, and I in that realization that hell was real, I knew I don't want to go there. And I began to run back to my body. And I ran with all of my might. I ran with all of my strength. I ran with such a realization that hell was real back to my body, that when the person who was doing the CPR on me, who had found me in that bathroom there in the back of that bar, they said one moment they are trying to revive my body, and the next minute I'm screaming and kicking. And so the complete difference of the first time that I had overdosed and this, I immediately was back in my body with the fervor that I was running with, screaming, kicking, clawing, and they jumped up off of me, and I ran for 2 blocks in the rain through the projects of East Nashville with the blood dripping down my arm. I'm running with all of my might to get away from the darkness that was reaching for me.
Well, in terms of, I always like to clarify a little bit with what I like to refer to as re-entry. So in the spirit, you're running back back through the veil, if you will. When you re-entered your body, was it you just woke back up and it's like that momentum from the other side just was continuing? Because for some people, they wake back up. Sometimes it can feel a little jarring as your spirit comes back into your body. I'm just curious if you have any additional insight on what that felt like.
I stopped when I realized I was back in my body, which was 2 blocks down the street from where I came back into my body. That whether that was the momentum of my fear to escape the hell that was reaching for me, the darkness that was reaching for me, I would have to say that would be it. It was like I stopped running when I realized I was back in my body. And then I looked around and found I'm down the street from where I died, from where I was. And so it took a while. It took that many moments for me to realize I'd made it back to my body. So for me, it was such a determination to get back to my body that's how far I had run before I realized I made it back to my body. I'm not dead.
Well, fast forward or move us forward. So you got the gospel presented to you in a way you'd never encountered in the chapel at the hospital when your first husband was dying. Um, you have this dramatic near death experience, and anybody who's had any kind of a near death experience will tell you your life is forever shifted one direction or the other. You had what I would refer to probably as a DNDE, a distressing or disturbing NDE, where it didn't have it wasn't angels and light and all that. It was very horrifying. How does God get a hold of your heart? What obviously, I think if somebody just met you on the street, they would not think any of this was part of your story. They would, I'm sure people are surprised when they hear your testimony. Um, Talk to us about how God gets a hold of your heart and things start moving in a completely, maybe even an unexpected direction for you at that point.
Well, when I died, that overdose was on a Sunday morning. I went to the church that my late husband had gone to that Sunday night. I just found I didn't even know when church services were supposed to be, but I called and found out they were going to have a service that night. And so I said, I'm going to be there. I got somebody to take me and drop me off over there. And I waited. I didn't know anything about the Bible, about God, other than that little bit that man had told me. I had been around church, but never really paid attention. Let me say it that way, to the gospel being preached. When I was there in the service that night, the preacher gave a call, an altar call at the end, and I went up, and I didn't know about how to say, hey, I need to make Jesus Lord of my life. I said, I died this morning and I went to hell and I need your help. Can you help me? And they weren't quite sure what to do with me. And so they prayed for me, but then just sent me along my way. But the people who had come to the hospital and prayed with me in the chapel found out that I was there at the church that night, and they hunted me down and took me to a revival. And it was then during that time I was on that methadone. They took me to a revival that was taking place in town. And the first night of the revival, I slept through it on these drugs because I thought I got to get myself off drugs. I got to make this happen because I need God and I got to clean myself up to come to God. So the next night they brought me back. That night they had taken me home and put prayer claws under my pillow and kept me at their house and prayed over me all night. Took me back to church the next day. And the preacher came back and woke me up because I was asleep again. And he said, Michelle, he said, girl, do you want help? And I said, I stood to my feet and I said, yes, I do. I want help. And he put his hand on me to pray for me. And the next thing I knew, I'm getting up off the floor. And I thought, well, did he knock me down? I'd never been in a church where the power of God moved. And I thought he knocked me down. But before I could be angry at him, I realized I was in my right mind. The addiction, it was like the addiction was gone. It was like I was free. It was such a shift from where I had been of this heavy weight. And they led me again in the prayer. And that was the night with that knowledge of making Jesus Lord of my life, committed my life to Jesus. That was August 10th of 1992. And I went home and all the drugs I had in my possession, I flushed them all down the toilet and began walking with the Lord. So a it was a total shift in me. that I knew that hell was real, and I did not ever want to go there. So I committed. I was all in.
Well, and just one more connection related to the near death experience. Some people report, after they have an experience, that they always kind of feel almost like I would describe it as there's kind of a thinness to the veil, like, or almost they almost have kind of a, I always like to say, a foot connected into the other side, in the sense that once those spiritual senses are heightened on the other side of the veil, that continues. Like, was there any kind of a heightened kind of spiritual? I don't want to say spiritual awakening, but sometimes people describe they can see in the spirit in a way they couldn't before. I'm just like, what were some of the after effects of having had that experience, if there were any?
Well, the determination is because it was so real to me that it stayed with me even after I came back to that place, that it was the confusion. And that's what had me looking to try to fix my life. And I got to clean myself up to go to God, because I don't want to go to hell. It was still very real. It was still, and even now I can sense the reality of it. It was something that became a motivation, something that became it was that clarity stayed with me concerning that. I made mention that I have experience in times. There have been two different operations that I had. One to have my gallbladder removed, a hysterectomy. And when I would come out, in those times that I've come out of anesthesia, I've experienced that same reality of my spirit being alive. At the time when I had died, and darkness was trying to reach into me, I wasn't at the place that I am now with God, but I had opened the door for God to move for me because I had asked for his help. But that realization, when I have, as a believer, both of the operations that I've had as a believer. And of course, I've prayed before the operation, and that spiritual strength. And then there have been other times that when God has given me dreams at night, that it was in that moment of waking up out of that dream, it was like a place in between that I've sensed that same place of reality, that same, not the position in front of the skull, but that same realm where things are so clear. And so it's that clarity that, when I've grown spiritually, and it's not something that you feel, but it's something that you recognize spiritually. As I've grown spiritually, I've recognized more that realm, if that makes sense.
Well, and I don't want to leave people completely hanging. We're almost at time, but I guess walk us a bit further forward in your journey. How did God move you in this direction where you end up in ministry? And clearly, God had a very strategic plan of where He was taking you. Looking at where you are today.
Well, that decision to make Jesus as the Lord and Savior of my life, that decision uh, set me on the course. I was determined to know God. I was determined to have my life. I had no idea I'd do what I'm doing today. I had no idea that He would have me ministering the gospel, teaching, writing books, any of that. But I was just determined to go hard after God. But as I did, and as I grew, um, I began to recognize the call of God on my life. And uh, shortly after I was saved, a year after I was saved, God brought Philip Steele into my life. I was saved in that church. They were in revival for a long time. So I got to go to church like 4 or 5 nights a week. And I was in the Word. I was growing. I was learning. About a year into that, I met and married my husband today, Philip Steele, who had a call of God, has a call of God on his life. He's the senior pastor of Faith Builders International. And so I began to walk with him in the call of God. And I found myself in a service one day. The minister had just opened up the altar for people who wanted to come up to, experience the anointing and to grow in the anointing. And so I had gone up to the altar, and I just thought, I'm going to the altar. I'm going to get prayer. It's going to lay hands on me, and I'm just going to receive. And I had no idea of what was about to happen. But as the minister laid hands on me, I fell out under the power of God, and I found myself in a vision. It was the first vision I had ever had in my life. And I probably was about 8 years into my walk with God at this point. Uh, I was standing on a precipice, or it was like a platform, and I was right at my feet were about head level of this congregation, this huge multitude of people. It was like a rock concert with people just packed in and standing shoulder to shoulder in this room. And I'm on this little platform just right above their heads. And I can sense the discontent. I can sense the aggravation, the frustration, the despair in the crowd. And I look down, and I'm wearing these tattered garments. And I began to talk about my tattered garments. And I began to share and I wasn't embarrassed. I wasn't ashamed of what I was wearing. I was pointing out, this is what happened to this part of my shirt. This is what happened. I'm pointing at these different holes and tattered places. And as I am sharing it, the people in this huge multitude of people began to turn their attention away from their frustration and their despair. And they began to listen to me, and they began to look at what I'm saying. And when they do, I realize when I have their attention, and the moment I have their attention, I point them up to Jesus, who is on this glorious platform above me. And he is shining brightly in his glory. And the moment I have the attention of the people, I point them to him. And now they're looking at him. And when I came out of that vision, I knew what the tattered garments represented. I knew those tattered garments were the life story, those portions of my life where I had experienced the destruction, the addiction, the shame of the prostitution of the life I was living, that I could use those things to get the attention of people and point them to the one who has the answers for their life, and that's the Lord Jesus Christ.
And Michelle, in terms of a reader takeaway from the book, from your story, I find, whether it's a near death experience story, people often fixate on one point from that story, or with a story as winding as yours with so many horrific things, people will kind of be struck by one particular thing. When you share your story, when you think of people reading this book, like, what's that takeaway, that one light, that gem that you're like, and everybody needs to get this from my story. You might have picked up on other things, but this is the message that you have to take away from it. What is that for you?
I think for me, it is no matter how far a person's life has gone in the wrong direction, no matter how low they have become in life with the wrong decisions, with the crimes they may have committed, with the things that they have done, because my story is a story that ultimately I'm the one who put myself in that place. All of the decisions that ended me up in that place were things that I could have made a different decision. And so the a lot of times people can look at a victim story a little bit easier than look at someone who said, I put myself in this place. I did this to myself. And no matter how far someone has gone, whether it's because of their own decisions or decisions that other people have placed them in, there is hope. And God can turn a life around. And I think he waited for it to come into a national worldwide platform 30 years later so people can see the before and the after of what he's done for me. Not just the before, but to see how far he's taken me from that place.
And I'd love to just kind of as we wrap up, sort of end with this. When people meet you, when they hear your story and you share, like, what kind of responses do you get? Like, people, I'm sure people are surprised and they're like, "Oh my goodness!" Is there any kind of common threads or themes in how people respond when you share your story?
The one that shocks me the most is how many teenagers like my story. And parents will tell me, my child doesn't really read, but they read your story and they read it more than once. And so the young people, the teenagers and the young adults who are gravitating towards this story and identifying with it, that has to be the thing for me. And you made mention of this at the beginning. A lot of family members find hope in this for people that they are watching go through some of the same things I lived through. And so, grandparents, parents, people who don't know how to reach their loved one who's in addiction or their loved one who is making lifestyle choices that are destroying their life, they're able to take this book, and especially since it has the fundamentals at the end, there's even things for how to pray for your loved one who might be walking through that. So those are the two people groups that I think surprised me in how much it's helping them.
And Michelle, what I love about your story is it's a real story of hope. That and it was interesting as you're sharing, kind of through your taking us through your journey about, you were feeling you had to kind of clean yourself up so you could go to God, and then you experienced this complete transformation from the inside out. And I love that, because our posture so often is like, I'm not good enough. I have to fix myself. I have to clean myself up. And we try to blend in and wear the same clothes as the church people and conform and look like we belong, and sort of fake it till we make it. But it's not until we just release it all and that transformation happens on the inside, then we're not having to posture and pretend anymore, because that transformation is real. So I just love that we're at the kind of at the 30-year anniversary of your journey. I think that's wonderful, and just such an example of that real transformation is possible, no matter what path you've taken throughout your life. Michelle, in terms of people connecting with your ministry, finding out more about what you do, finding out more about the book, where they can get their own copy, what's the best place for us to connect with you, discover you on the web?
Our website is buildfaith.net, buildfaith.net. And that has access to all of our YouTube channel, our podcast, um, different things you can connect to through our live stream for our church. We have our church campus in Little Rock, Arkansas, and we also have a campus in DeSoto, Kansas, which is right outside of Kansas City. So I am in both places alternate weekends. And so all of those links are there at buildfaith.net.
And we'll make it easy, like we do with every episode. We'll have links in the description and the show notes to the website Michelle mentioned, as well as links to places where you can pick up your very own copy of her new book. It's time to bring this episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show to a close. Many thanks for being a part of my conversation with Michelle Steele. Once again, our book today was Escaping Hell, a true story of God's miraculous power to restore a life bent on destruction. And Michelle, I want to say thank you so much for sharing with us today, challenging us, inspiring us, but showing us that God can transform a life no matter where it's gone. It's been such a blessing.
Thank you so much, Shaun. It's been an honor to be on your program. Thank you.